We have next is Cliff Majersik with the IMT, as we were kind of perfect natural progression there. Cliff is riding shotgun in DC, but he is definitely not second fiddle. He's our keynote speaker for this first module. He is a pioneer in reflecting building performance in appraisal, lending, building codes, and building performance policies that have gained national prominence. His advice is often sought in developing legislation, including instrumental work on the first ever benchmarking and transparency law in 2008 and the first ever BPS in 2018, both in the District of Columbia. He has helped develop benchmarking and BPS laws in dozens of other states and cities, including Chicago, New York, California, and many others. So next up, we have Cliff.
And this is my first rodeo, so thank you very much for having me. I am pleased to speak with all of you, and I apologize I can't be there in person, but I hope that we can have an interactive conversation. I have a slideshow that I'm going to share in a moment, and I wanted to say, in response to the question I heard about ROI, we do actually have some case studies that look at ROI from retrofits to improve building energy efficiency. Several case studies, including 2 of them from Chicago. So that may be of interest. I put a link to that in the chat, and perhaps Benny or somebody else can share that with anybody who may be interested. Also, we have a couple of slides. I have a couple of slides at the end of this deck that speak to that ROI question. So let me talk to you mostly about building performance standards and what's happening elsewhere to give you all a better idea of what to expect in Chicago as Mayor Johnson's administration moves forward with their plans. Before I begin on that, a moment about IMT. IMT is a nonprofit. We're headquartered here in Washington, D.C., but we have folks all around the country, including in Chicagoland. And our mission is to drive demand for high-performance buildings as a way of benefiting everyone, regardless where they live, work, or play, and fighting climate change. So we're very much about serving as translators between real estate and policymakers, between finance and appraisal and building operations and building science. We sort of try to translate and allow these disparate experts to work together and achieve great things. So with that, let me see. I've got to pull up my slides. Okay. So we spend more than 90% of our time in buildings. So buildings significantly impact our health and our well-being. They account for 74% of U.S. energy consumption and 1/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions. The energy wasted in our buildings adds to our costs. It makes our air dirtier. It increases our vulnerability to power outages and climate-related disasters. And we know that high-performance buildings can reduce energy use, save money, and help achieve our ambitious climate commitments. This is all familiar to you all. We currently are upgrading less than 2% of our workplaces and schools and less than 0.2% of our homes on an annual basis. That's just not fast enough. I mean, you all are doing great work. There's a lot of great things that are happening in Chicago and elsewhere, but it's just not, the pace of improvement is not sufficient to prevent catastrophic climate change and achieve climate commitments. So jurisdictions are looking to try new, more powerful policies to improve that pace of change. And building performance policies are the policies that show the most promise to accelerate the improvement in our built environment. This is a map which some of you may have seen before. IMT has maintained this map for many years, and it keeps getting more and more colors on the map. The orange are benchmarking and transparency laws, and you can see, of course, that Chicago and Evanston are on there. We're going to have to add Oak Park. And the purple are policies that go beyond benchmarking. They include benchmarking, but they also include other requirements. Often it's auditing and retro-commissioning or retuning. But the newest addition is building performance standards. And those building performance standards are popping up around the country. Here is a map of building performance standards around the country. The jurisdictions in green already have building performance standards. There are 12 jurisdictions around the country, 4 states and 8 localities that already have building performance standards. And again, we need to update this map. Oregon just recently adopted a statewide building performance standard. So Oregon will be showing in green in the next few days. And Also on this map are jurisdictions that have joined the National Building Performance Standard Coalition. These are jurisdictions that are committing to adopt building performance standards themselves and to adopt legislation, either a building performance standard or a piece of legislation that's on that path by Earth Day next year. And you can see, of course, that Chicago is one of the jurisdictions, one of the 45 jurisdictions around the country that are part of the National Building Performance Standard Coalition. And this is a coalition announced by President Biden in January 2021. Building performance standards are the most powerful tool for driving improvement in the existing building stock. There have been a number of projections of what impact the existing building performance standards will have. I'm not going to go through them all, but just looking at New York City in the dark blue here, you can see they're projecting $20 billion of investment in their building stock as a consequence of their building performance standard and the creation of 126,000 new jobs. Obviously, New York City is the biggest city in the country, but it gives you a sense of the potential scale of a building performance standard in Chicago. What is a building performance standard? It's a standard that applies to existing buildings that requires successively more ambitious performance across one or more quantitative metrics. And for example, that could be a site energy use intensity, how much energy is being used in that building. So buildings have to show improvement on that metric year over year. It applies to a large swath of public and private buildings over a certain size, and most of these are applying to buildings 25 to 50,000 square feet and larger. And it has preset dates by which the performance must improve. So this is not a building code which only kicks in when you're pulling building permits. These are requirements that apply to all buildings, even if they're not making any improvements, even if there's no change in occupancy, they still have to comply with the quantitative requirements. So in that way, it complements building codes. It's different from and complementary to building codes. They work hand in hand, and that's why Mayor Johnson's administration is talking about both the new construction policy and the building performance standard for existing buildings. What makes a building performance standard different? Well, they provide requirements across a wide range of buildings. They can yield deep retrofits at scale across many, many buildings. They can drive value-creating investments that add to the value of the buildings by private building owners using their own capital or capital that they've borrowed. They provide comprehensive approach to performance, so you can regulate multiple aspects of building performance. You could also include water or health as part of a building performance standard. They balance flexibility because we know that buildings aren't here to save energy. Buildings are here to house and provide a place to work and play. But also, they are driving immediate action because the climate crisis demands that we move as quickly as possible. And they send a long-term signal to the market with long-term certainty if designed correctly. So here are three examples of three different building performance standards around the country. The first in Washington, D.C., it starts applying to buildings 50,000 square feet and larger, and it scales down over time to 10,000 square feet. All three of these policies apply to commercial and multifamily buildings. In fact, just about every building performance standard, with one or two exceptions, applies to commercial and multifamily buildings, with certain narrow exceptions. Often manufacturing and agriculture are exempted. In Washington, D.C. and in St. Louis, the building performance standards are recalculated every compliance cycle, every 5 years or so. And that 5 years is chosen because it lines up pretty well with most capital planning cycles. In New York and other jurisdictions, the building performance standards are preset many years into the future. And we regard that as a best practice because it provides long-term certainty to building owners. If you're asking someone to invest in a long-lived asset like a heat pump that may have a 30-year life, it's good for them to have 30 years of visibility into how well that building is going to have to perform so they can know that this investment will put them on path to comply. In St. Louis, they're using site energy use intensity as the performance metric. That's increasingly becoming the most common building performance metric that we're seeing with new building performance standards. And in New York, they have greenhouse gas emissions per square foot as the performance metric. And you can see in New York, the minimum size is 25,000 square feet. and in St. Louis, it's 50,000 square feet. So in response to a number of jurisdictions developing their building performance standards, and IMT actually helped these jurisdictions develop those building performance standards, jurisdictions came to us and they said, we need help figuring out how to write our own building performance standard. And so we developed a model building performance standard law that takes into account the best practices from all the existing laws and lessons learned. And quite frankly, some of the laws, there's a lot of room for improvement. So we worked with real estate, with equity advocates, with governments, with lawyers, with utilities and financiers, and developed a model law. We actually got more than 25 pages of comments from the Real Estate Roundtable, just one real estate trade association as an example. That model law now serves as the starting point for most new building performance standards that have been adopted recently or that are being introduced. And we have pending building performance standard laws in states like California and Massachusetts. And we have a number of resources on our website, imt.org/BPS, regarding building performance standards. So as you're designing a building performance standard, we think some basic principles should be kept in mind. You want to make sure you're aligning with your goals and commitments, and most prominently that would be make sure that your building performance standard is putting your jurisdiction on path to achieve its climate commitments. Always, social and racial equity should be centered. Any policy should make your jurisdiction more equitable, not less. Regulatory fairness, that's about treating building owners fairly. So one building owner shouldn't arbitrarily have to make really big improvements, while another building owner doesn't have to improve very much at all. Of course, everyone wants jobs and economic growth, and we know that every administration, every government wants to see that. And in order to get jobs and economic growth, certainty is really important. What we've seen is if building owners don't have a pretty good long-term view of what they're going to be required to do, they tend to hold off on making investments in things like heat pumps that will improve building performance and jobs. We want to see early action to address the climate crisis, but we also know that there are certain times when it's easiest and best for buildings to make improvements. So at end of life of equipment, at tenant turnover, when you're refinancing a mortgage and you can roll in additional capital to make improvements in your building into that new mortgage. So having some flexibility to accommodate those life cycle events is important. And then, of course, you always want to keep things as simple as possible, in part to make it as easy as possible for building owners to comply and as easy as possible for governments to implement. So one innovation in our model law, which has been picked up in multiple jurisdictions that have adopted new building performance standards, and which expresses several of these principles, is the trajectory approach. And in this example, we're looking at 3 office buildings, but this same approach can apply to any building type. And one of the important things about building performance standards is that they recognize that buildings are different. So you can't hold an office building to the same standard that you would hold a hotel or a restaurant. You have to have different standards for different types of buildings. So you're comparing apples to apples, you're comparing office buildings to office buildings. In this graph, the vertical axis is site energy use intensity. So you want to go down to have lower energy use. And the horizontal axis is time. And so we start basically today, the baseline, and you move out to a final performance year. And typically that would be sort of 20, 30 years out to give long-term certainty. And every building is expected to perform at the same level relative to each other in that final year, say 30 years out. But in order to more equitably distribute the level of effort across buildings, you don't expect every building to reach the same level right away. So those buildings that start out using the most energy, and in this example, that's building A, are permitted to continue to use the most energy in every interim period. And you have interim periods about every 5 years. This is a simplified illustration. If you had a final performance standard 30 years out, you might have 5 interim periods. And so in every interim period, the buildings that start out using the most energy are permitted to continue to use the most energy, but they also are expected to improve at the fastest rate. This provides long-term certainty to the building owners, and it equitably distributes the level of effort. This is not prescribing any particular technology. So building owners know their buildings best, and they can choose what improvements they want to make. And it doesn't just have to be physical improvements. You can also get credit just by turning off the lights at night and other operational improvements that cost nothing. So this is a way of providing long-term certainty, the flexibility to move when it works best for buildings, but also driving early action to the greatest extent possible. And we know that buildings don't actually improve in straight lines. This is an illustration. Again, the building performance standards don't prescribe any technology. The building owner will choose what improvements they'll make. But in this one example, it's just an example, a building owner could choose a different sequence. In this one example, a building owner might make lighting upgrades and the building tune-up in the first period. That improves the building's performance enough that it's in compliance for the first interim standard. Then they maybe make some envelope upgrades that improves the building's performance enough that it's in compliance for the second cycle. And then they make a mechanical upgrade, and that brings it to the level of performance that is needed to comply with the final standard. Because the actual performance is below the line, it's below the point at every interim standard, that building is compliant at every point, but it's of course not improving in a straight line. Now, we heard from Brian and Katie about what's happening in Chicago. Of course, Chicago's been working on this for a long time. I helped Chicago write its benchmarking law back in 2013, and the update to the law in 2017 to add the rating system, which is a important and groundbreaking innovation that has been used elsewhere, including New York City. And in 2022, Chicago joined the Building Performance Standard Coalition. And later that year, Mayor Lightfoot released the recommendations of the Chicago Building Decarb Policy Working Group, which recommended a host of policies, including a building performance standard. And then most recently in July, Mayor Johnson's administration announced that they would put in place these new construction requirements, as well as a building performance standard for existing buildings. So as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the return on investment. And there have been a number of academic studies that have looked at Energy Star buildings and compared those buildings to similar buildings, same locations, same age. So apples to apples comparisons, class A to class A, that sort of thing, mostly office buildings. And what they've found is that the Energy Star buildings, as compared to similar but non-Energy Star peers, command a 5 to 16% rental premium, a 6 to 31% sales price premium, and a 3 to 6% occupancy premium. So that is higher occupancy or lower vacancy rates. And there's 6 different academic studies that looked at different data sets over different time periods. You can see the link at the bottom has links to all of those studies. There was also a study that went into depth on one owner's portfolio from around the country, and it used non-public data, so some things like tenant concessions, to really dig in and verify. And unsurprisingly, they found that the high-performance buildings, the green buildings, had 17% lower operating expenses. That's what you would expect. They're spending less on energy, they're spending less on water because they're more efficient. What may be less expected is that they actually had 28% higher net operating income. And that's because not only did they have lower expenses, but they had higher rents and lower vacancy rates. So of course that translates into a higher NOI. So what you see is that buildings get very good return on investment in most cases from investing in building improvements, in energy improvements, and electrification in some cases. And as I mentioned, we have case studies. We saw in our case studies very frequently sort of $2 to $3 of added property value for every $1 invested in these improvements. Obviously, different buildings are different, and deeper improvements tend to take a little bit longer to pay off. But there's money to be made from these improvements that will also help comply with the building performance standard. So some key takeaways for building owners from the fact that Chicago and other jurisdictions are looking at adopting building performance standards. One thing is just to make sure that your benchmarking is accurate. What we have found is, building performance standards, they rely on the Energy Star Portfolio Manager tool for compliance. That's how you'll do your reporting. Your bidding will be evaluated based on that. And as jurisdictions have gone from having just a benchmarking law to having a building performance standard, the stakes are higher because now you're actually going to be held accountable and have to pay an alternative compliance fee if your building doesn't meet a level of performance. And so building owners are paying more attention, and sometimes they're finding that their benchmarking information is inaccurate and going back and having to correct that. But it's much better to know upfront where you stand, have accurate benchmarking information. So pay real attention to that. Hire consultants if you're having consultants do it they're high quality consultants that are a good job of getting the right inputs into the portfolio manager system that generates those benchmark scores. But also think about sort of future proofing your portfolio. The time is now to improve your building's performance, to build it into your capital plans, to include in your due diligence checklist information about the building's performance, its Energy Star score, the energy use, make sure the tenant's energy data is in the system. You also want to align your incentives with your tenant's incentives, so both of you come out ahead when the building performs well. And so performance-based leases, which are win-win for both the landlord and tenant, and which they're like green leases, and we actually run the Green Lease Leaders program with the U.S. Department of Energy, but they're specifically designed for use in jurisdictions that have building performance standards so that the tenants have skin in the game and they will have a reason to work with you, the owner, to have the building perform better and comply with the building performance standard. And you can go to greenleaseleaders.org and download the performance-based lease language. And also, I encourage folks, I think some of you probably are already green lease leaders, but if you're not, look at applying for that recognition. Also, as you're designing new buildings, as soon as they've entered into operations, they're existing buildings and they're subject to building performance standards. So put into your specs up front that you want very low energy use intensity. So, specify, look at what are the best in class now, and set EUI targets for your buildings before you go to select a design team. And that will ensure that any design team that is bidding for the work actually is prepared to do a very high efficiency building. What you see if you have a design team that doesn't know how to do that, often you're going to get change orders and it's get more expensive. Whereas a design team that knows from the beginning that they're shooting for, say a 20 site EUI, they're going to be able to do that much less expensively without the kind of change orders you might worry about otherwise. And make sure that everybody is on board, that you have everybody rowing in the same direction. Change job descriptions, include building performance as an evaluation criteria for your engineers, for your property managers, and others, so everybody is incented to have the building succeed. And as you heard from Katie and from Brian, the Energy Resource Hub is going to have lots of good resources to help you do all of these things, and also to help you take advantage of the federal, state, and utility incentives and loans that are out there. As you heard, the Inflation Reduction Act has a lot of money, most of which hasn't hit the market yet, that's going to be available for you all to improve your buildings. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you, Cliff. You certainly nailed it on the head. I think, doing the due diligence and the homework to understand where your building sits or where the prospective building sits is obviously the first step, because knowledge is power, and having that measured quantity there is, you don't know where to go if you don't have that information. I think I've also heard from financial advisors that the best time to invest in things like this is 10 years ago, but the second best time is now. So certainly motivating factors with what's going on in the legislation in this area, and making sure that our buildings are tip top. So anyone have questions for Cliff?
Amir Rizai, also from Cyclone Energy Group. Great presentation. I'm going to throw something at you that I know is a hard question, but we live in a sort of great divide type of climate right now, right? And you mentioned a couple times certainty, both from the client side and owners, to long-term planning. I want to hear your thoughts on building performance standards as a very strong tool and their potential immunity to political change at local level. Are there things and mechanisms built in that, we know when the building performance standards in place, we can rely on it for 10, 20, 30 years, make sure that it's not going to be abolished with the next local administration or a national one. Maybe plays into that the whole conversation about national BPS as well. Like, if you have any insights into how mechanisms like that are built into that for the long-term certainty, essentially, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we work so closely with real estate, because I think you want to have everybody at the table to develop these policies. And when you have a consensus that's broadly has a broad foundation with building owners who've helped develop the policy, with communities, and we think it's really important for community-based organizations representing frontline communities to be part of designing policies to make sure that frontline communities are benefited. And with the elected officials and others all at the table, then I think you have a consensus that can be durable. What we don't want to see is a situation where you're trying to rule an important group of stakeholders without having them have a strong voice in what comes out. But also we think jurisdictions have made commitments, and they need to be clear that failure is not an option. So we encourage them to go to their real estate stakeholders and say, we have this commitment, we have to hit this commitment in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions or other commitments. And we know that our buildings account, in Chicago's case, I think buildings account for well over half of greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to work with you. We need for new and existing buildings to generate a lot less greenhouse gas emissions. But let's make this a partnership. Let's work together and figure out what kind of long-term certainty and flexibility and other provisions that we can put in there that will work for real estate, because real estate is critical to every jurisdiction's economy, and it needs to thrive, and no mayor wants to cause their real estate industry to tank. So having that partnership, but having some real commitment to achieving results, I think it produces a durable policy. And then once building owners have built things into their capital plans, and tenants and leases and everything else, nobody's going to want to turn back the clock, because they want to have long-term certainty. And yes, you could try to have a law abolished, but then the next mayor might just put in a different law. It's much better for all concerned to have a set policy that provides long-term certainty that you can base your investments on, and you can profit in that environment.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Bill.
I got him, Dave.
Yeah, hi, Cliff. Bill Bonfluth from Penn State. Very interesting talk. I took a lot of points on how to move BPS forward. You probably know I come from more of the indoor environmental quality side of the house, and I was glad to hear you say that building performance standards could address metrics other than energy and carbon, and yet you didn't offer a single example of one that does. And I'd like to know what you know about who's advocating for a broader approach to building performance standards that will address indoor air quality and well-being and some of these other issues that are in many ways equally important.
Oh yeah, they're super important, and we're one of the folks that are advocating for that. Our model law includes 5 metrics. It's site energy use intensity, on-site greenhouse gas emissions, which is intended to drive electrification, and those probably don't come as a surprise. Also water, and the one that maybe is of greatest interest to you is indoor air quality, or specific ventilation. Ultimately, we want to see multiple measures of indoor air quality be part of it. It's remarkable, especially after a pandemic from an airborne virus, that we don't already have widespread requirements around ventilation and filtration. As a first step, we recommend, and we worked with the International Well Building Institute in developing these recommendations, and with other indoor air quality experts. And as a first step, we recommend looking at carbon dioxide, not because of its greenhouse gas potential, but because it's actually a good marker of ventilation, and it's relatively cheap and inexpensive to monitor. So, we don't, different jurisdictions would choose different levels, but, in our research, and it's really more IWBI's research, it seems like 1,000 parts per million CO2 was a decent level. It's not a great level, but when you're talking about a mandate as opposed to a voluntary standard, you have to be more permissive. So we recommend as a consideration for your starting requirement would be that buildings would have to achieve 1,000 parts per million CO2 to indicate that they have adequate ventilation. And of course, that's just ventilation really that it's measuring, but that will go a long way towards protecting against airborne viruses and things like that. And then looking down the road in future cycles to adding specific indoor airborne pollutants requirements around that as well.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to just follow up. Maybe you saw the Johns Hopkins Model State Indoor Air Quality Act that was just rolled out about 2-3 weeks ago. I think that is something that you might want to take on board and consider whether you can connect some of that with what you're doing, because I think it would be in the same general direction that you're moving.
Yeah, that would be great. And perhaps you and I should hop on a call. I'd love to pick your brain about best practices here.
Yep, feel free. Thank you.
Excellent. And Cliff, you had mentioned that there are 5 metrics. What was the 5th one?
Sorry, the 5th one is coincident peak demand, which is basically about having a building be a good grid citizen. We know, and you heard some questions about this before, that our grid is going to be tested, especially in winters in places like Chicago, by electrification, as more and more buildings are dealing with heating through electricity rather than natural gas. That will create a challenge for the grid. And there are a couple ways to address that challenge. One would be just to build new power plants, new transmission, new distribution. That would be pretty expensive. That would be a lot more expensive than the alternative, which is transforming our buildings from a grid liability to a grid asset. So buildings that can shed load at peak times through things like storage, through things like better design, through on-site generation, and potentially even send electricity back to the grid at peak times and be rewarded for it. So that's partly about tariffs and demand response payments to building owners, which in general are way too low. But it's also can be part of a building performance standard that is holding buildings to specific levels of coincident peak demand. And coincident peak demand is the amount of electricity that is being used at the peak time. So we're happy for buildings to use lots of electricity when there's lots of low cost, low carbon electricity on the grid and not much demand. It's afternoons like we've had a lot of this summer when it's 95 degrees outside and everybody's cranking up their air conditioning. That really test the grid, and we want buildings to be able to shed load at those times.
Well, thank you. It sounds like a really good opportunity for things like the emerging technologies segment of ComEd and other folks to get involved and start communicating with other folks who are professionals in this area, such as yourself.
Yeah, Cliff, this is Benny Skelton with Cyclone. Our company works a lot with developers, and a lot of our practice in the last couple of years has been shifting. So we work in a lot of markets like Denver, where there is very aggressive growth in multifamily residential, and there is a BPS in place. And now we're evaluating buildings and design for the penalties that they might have. And so my question is, in talking to the city of Chicago here, they're very anti-penalty. Can a BPS work without a financial penalty?
Well, this is a bit semantic, so maybe I'm splitting hairs here, but we don't like the word penalty for these policies.
Non-compliance.
Yeah, we like non-compliance fee because we recognize that tenants need to be part of the solution. And if you call it a penalty under most existing commercial leases, the tenants don't have to pay any part of it. But if you call it a fee, then the owner can pass through a portion of it, an appropriate portion to the tenant per their lease. And we think that's important for giving tenants skin in the game so that because we know tenants drive a lot of energy use and they need to be part of the solution. They need to be incented to work with the owners to make it perform better. But yeah, I mean, we don't like to talk a lot about the penalty side. We want to talk about success, not failure. But the reality is we think that there probably needs to be some consequences for noncompliance, or it's more of a suggestion than a policy. That said, I mean, we're also happy to work with jurisdictions, and we do work with jurisdictions to offer incentives. To, it's all carrot and no stick. But a lot of jurisdictions have been doing that for a long time, and it's produced good results, but not resulting in improvement fast enough to achieve the kind of climate commitments that cities like Chicago have. So that's why jurisdictions are turning to building performance standards that do have consequences for noncompliance. And we recognize that's the hardest part from a political perspective of the conversation. And I think people need to be humble and respectful and know that building owners are important citizens, important part of the economy, and approach the topic respectfully, but respectfully, require that buildings have to perform at a certain level, just as they're subject to other requirements now, and they should be part of the process of developing those requirements.
So just kind of following up then on that topic, when we work with the BOMA crowd here, I think they're Class A commercial office buildings. They perform very well with Energy Star. They're typically in compliance. But then your Class B and C office buildings aren't, or they've never done a benchmarking before. Here in Chicago, we've had the ordinance for a while. Everybody's doing it, but they're not being really necessarily pushed because it's a shame policy, not necessarily anything to making them try to make things better. Are you seeing any kind of policies develop where those buildings that are doing well are subsidizing the buildings that aren't, or anything like that for like the carrots side of thing?
Yeah, I mean, some of these building performance standards, they take the proceeds if there are buildings that are paying alternative compliance fees as their way of complying because their performance isn't good enough. They can take the revenue that comes from that and provide it, say, to affordable housing buildings that may not have the capital to make improvements, so that they can improve as well. And I think that's good. What we don't want is a situation where jurisdictions are looking at building performance standards as a revenue opportunity to add to the general fund. We'd like to keep the money in the built environment, but shift any payments that are received to those buildings that lack the capital to make the needed improvements. Because we don't want to leave anyone behind. We don't want to leave residents of affordable housing behind by, say, subjecting them to lower standards so that their buildings aren't as energy efficient. They're left paying higher utility bills and potentially having worse indoor air quality.
Yeah, I think it's important that you.
Sorry, I was just going to say, you see that several of the jurisdictions like Boston, for instance, that's built into their building performance standard. The money goes into a trust fund, and also best practice is to have a community-led process, frontline communities, to have a role in deciding how to invest some of that money for the benefit of frontline communities that have been subject to things like systemic racism. Sorry, go ahead, David.
No, mine wasn't nearly as groundbreaking as any of that, but in other areas where there's beyond benchmarking or something that's the next level of what you need to do or prove that you're doing something, I think that's probably a natural progression of where some of the areas of Chicago might find itself. And San Jose just passed their beyond benchmarking just this past year, to where buildings 40,000 square feet, big box stores, are now having to comply with benchmarking and actually making big changes where they were never really expected of that before. So I think we're seeing a lot of kind of sea change across what demographics of buildings, especially in commercial, are being expected to work through this stuff. All right. Any other questions that folks have out here? We've got Cliff for another few minutes. Yes, John.
John Katrakis with JT Katrakis and Associates. I've been working in this area for about 30 years and have actually measured in the Chicago area the increase with my handheld CO2 monitor, the increase in CO2 levels in this area. Also recently, I'm working on a lakefront project, and I've noticed just the weather data for the Chicago area shows a 3.5 degree increase in summertime temperatures over the last 22 years. I'm just wondering, is there any kind of database that talks about these changes in like large metropolitan areas around the country that can maybe help benchmark, cities and how they're being impacted by climate change, and that maybe that'd be a help policy-wise if there was some kind of comparison. 'Cause I would think you'd see these changes, especially in larger metropolitan areas, and actually your 45 member list, I guess, mostly covers those areas. But I'm curious if you've noticed any kind of, if there's anybody trending that and looking at that for the various metropolitan areas of the country, if that would be a helpful policy tool. And the related issue is, what do we use for predicting future energy use of these buildings? To use a 20-year-old average is really not helpful.
That's a really good point. We can't just look at the past to predict the future, because we know that because of climate change, the future isn't going to look like the past. That's why 2023 is almost certain to go, into the record books as the hottest year ever. And unfortunately, there's a pretty good chance that 2024 will beat the records from 2023. Weather normalization now does rely on 30-year average figures from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. And I think that you can get more, you can look at the actual trends from NOAA, but I invite, if somebody else is more knowledgeable about that, I'd invite people to speak to that. Some jurisdictions have created climate readiness plans where they look at forecasts. They call it downscaling. You take the work of groups like the International Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. You take the same science that they were using and you localize it. What does that impact look like right here in Chicago? And how many more heat emergency days are we likely to see in 2030 and 2040 and beyond? And how do we make plans that account for that? And that, things like flooding, a lot of times subway entrances are not high enough and water can flood in them. So it can be huge infrastructure challenges that you need to invest in, and being able to predict what the climate is going to look like 30 years out is really important when you're talking about a 30, 50, 100-year asset. But perhaps somebody can provide more specific data sources in answer to the question.
Yeah, and Cliff, now that your BPS in DC, as an example, has been in place now for over 5 years, have you gone back to that area and investigated some of the broader benefits and impacts that it's had?
Yeah, we are. We're doing some case studies. I mean, it's still early days in the sense that it was passed in 2018, signed in 2019, but the first deadline is not for another couple of years. You haven't seen any of the building performance standards actually have a deadline, a major deadline in terms of actual building performance that has come through yet. Your first deadlines are going to be next year in 2024. So we're going to be learning a lot, but we do already see buildings that are investing in improvements, developers that are building this into their specs so that they're telling their design teams to have lower EUIs as part of that process. We're seeing an uptick in demand for these services. In job training and job growth, and that's another important reason why long-term certainty is needed, because in order to triple, quadruple, 10x the number of buildings that are going to be renovated, we're going to need to significantly increase that workforce, and that's a long-term investment in training new people, both an investment on the part of companies that are hiring and an investment on the part of people that are receiving that training. And so it's really important that we stay the course, provide long-term certainty so that entrepreneurs have the confidence to invest in expanding their capacity and meeting that future demand. And we do see that coming, especially in places like Denver and DC and New York that have had the policies in place for a few years and are investing the resources needed to properly implement it.
That's great. Cameron.
Cliff, this is Cameron with Where Malcolm. What you just said prompted me to think, who's responsible for enforcement of all of this? And is it the building departments of these municipalities have taken that on? Are they ready? Right? If the first big deadline is coming in 2024 for some of these municipalities, what do we think that's going to look like?
Sure. Yeah, it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I think in Chicago, it would probably be the building department. They've been involved in policy discussions. That's a logical place for it to live when the building department is properly resourced and has the desire to take on that new responsibility. And so you do see, like in places like St. Louis and New York, it's the building department that's enforcing. In some other jurisdictions, it's a different office. But in terms of do they, I think that they are staffing up. Jurisdiction is going to need to hire new people. This is not something that is self-executing. There are going to need to be people, just as you have plan reviewers that are reviewing plans. You're going to have people in your building department or whatever agency is responsible that are out there looking at submissions from buildings, making sure they're complying, and also. We recommend a mechanism, we call it a building performance action plan, because buildings are different and some of them, due to historic constraints, they won't be able to meet the standard, or leasing constraints, or a variety of reasons, and you'll need to give them some flexibility. And so there'll need to be a process where they can apply for basically more time or to a different standard And that it's going to take something like almost plan reviewers to review those applications. I have confidence that the ones that have these 2024 deadlines are staffing up and are going to do a good job. And we're doing everything we can to work with jurisdictions to put in place the resources needed to execute on these. And that's one thing I tell jurisdictions, don't pass the law if you're not committed to putting the resources in to properly implement it, because that's not doing anybody any favors.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, Cameron, specific to the city of Chicago, the building department here is expecting that to fall on them. However, Commissioner Rodeo is really focused on fixing the permitting process. We've got the reputation for the worst city in the country when it comes to permitting and processing time. So they're staffing that up right now, but they realize this is going to be probably the next step for them.
Yeah, and if what Cliff is saying, over 120,000 jobs are necessary to execute endeavors such as this, I can only imagine that Chicago is probably not too far behind that. All right. Any other questions for Cliff? Going once. All right. Well, thank you so much, Cliff. We really appreciate your time today.
My pleasure. And thank you all for what you're doing. It's really important.